Welcome to Current Affairs with Faraz, your trusted source for unbiased, in-depth analysis of global geopolitical developments. Out in the middle of the ocean, one single oil tanker has become the focal point of an extremely dangerous game of chicken. What started as a pretty routine sanctions bust has now escalated, pitting the United States directly against Russia. It's become a high-stakes test of resolve, where just one wrong move could spark a conflict between two nuclear-armed powers.
It's a real powder keg, for sure. So the big question is, how on earth did we get here? How did this one ship, thousands of miles from any Russian port, become such a critical flashpoint?
To really get what's happening, you have to look at the story of the ship itself. It's like a masterclass in modern geopolitical gamesmanship. It shows how these shadow networks and legal loopholes are quickly becoming the new battlegrounds for the great powers.
Yeah, this ship didn't just sail into a superpower crisis overnight. It actually started its journey under a totally different name, the Bella 1. The U.S. had flagged it for being part of a shadow network, basically for hauling Venezuelan oil, which is a direct violation of U.S. sanctions.
Exactly. So, from Washington's point of view, this whole thing kicked off as a pretty straightforward law enforcement action. The goal was simple. Go intercept a sanctioned vessel that's carrying illegal cargo. So U.S. naval forces started tracking the Bella 1 across the North Atlantic.
But this is where a simple chase just goes completely off the rails. As the U.S. ships were closing in, the crew did something incredible. They literally painted a Russian flag on the side of the hull, right there in the middle of the ocean. And then, a short time later, the ship pops up on Moscow's official registry with a brand new name, the Marinara. Just an unbelievable transformation, all happening at sea.
And look, this wasn't just a paint job. It was an incredibly clever and really risky strategic move. By claiming the protection of the Russian flag, the ship's operators changed the entire game in an instant. This wasn't about enforcing sanctions anymore. Suddenly, this was about national sovereignty.
And that is the absolute key difference here. Chasing the Bella 1, that's a police action, against what you could call a criminal operation. But the second it becomes the Marinara, an officially registered Russian vessel, well, now any attempt by the U.S. to stop it could be spun by Moscow as an act of aggression against Russia itself.
And Moscow did not waste a second. They immediately issued a formal diplomatic warning to Washington telling them to back off. This statement from their foreign ministry lays out their argument perfectly. They very skillfully created this legal gray area where they can now accuse the West of violating the freedom of the seas.
But here's the thing. The United States has not backed down, not even a little. In fact, in response to Russia's move, Washington has very publicly ramped up its military presence in the area. It's sending a crystal clear signal that a forced boarding, an interdiction, is still very much an option.
Oh, the American response has been incredibly serious and deliberate. We've seen P-8 maritime patrol aircraft, those are the Navy's top-of-the-line surveillance planes. They're tracking the tanker's every move. We're also seeing heavy transport and refueling planes being moved, which you'd need for a complex operation this far from land. But the biggest tell? Special operations platforms are being staged. That's a huge sign that Washington is getting the specialized teams ready to board that ship, whether it has a Russian flag on it or not.
And it's so important to understand that this isn't just happening in a bubble. This standoff is coming right on the heels of President Trump's announcement of a massive naval blockade to enforce sanctions on Venezuelan oil. So this ship, the Marinara, it's become the very first real test of that blockade's credibility and of Washington's will to enforce it.
Which brings us to the incredibly difficult question that's now sitting on the desk in the White House. This whole thing has moved way beyond just a single tanker of oil. The outcome here is going to set a huge precedent with some really massive geopolitical ripple effects.
The choice it's stark. There are no good options. If the U.S. military boards and seizes that tanker, Russia will almost certainly scream that it's an illegal act of piracy, that it shatters international law, and that risks a direct military response. But if Washington blinks, if they let the ship go, it sends a message to the entire world that all you have to do to get around American power is raise a Russian flag. It would basically destroy the Venezuelan blockade before it even really gets started.
And that's exactly what makes this whole situation so incredibly tense. A single decision made out there in the Atlantic could literally rewrite the unwritten rules of engagement between the world's biggest powers. Any misstep by anyone risks turning this tense standoff into a full-blown NATO-level crisis. Thanks for joining Current Affairs with Faraz. Subscribe for more real analysis, and we'll see you in the next update.